Welcome back to Prosperity Playbook. You are here with Courtney, Renee, Jill, and Britt. And we're four friends that came together realizing that our life lessons that we did not learn in school were pretty valuable, and we decided we would share those with you. So today we're going to talk about something that might not be the most fun topic, but that's a super important one to talk about. So bear with us. We'll get a little bit nerdy, but not too nerdy, I promise. So this is Estate Planning 101. So we're going to kind of dive in here, mostly with Jill, since she's our resident attorney and our expert here. So I think we'll just kind of dive in on wills to start with. So
let's back up, because last year somebody was like, I'm going to go meet with my attorney to talk about estate planning. And I was like, what the hell is estate planning?
Good point.
That's how Jill and I met.
It is.
I was trying to help my parents.
Awesome. All right. I love it. So you're right. Let's back up here. And estate planning just means you're talking about what happens when you pass away. So this topic kind of came up for us in one of our previous episodes when we were talking about how money is just a taboo topic and nobody likes to talk about it. And I think this is definitely one of those categories that people don't love talking about, especially those older generations, our grandparents and even some of our parents. They don't want us to know what they got, and they don't want to know who's getting it. Mm-hmm. So my hope is that we can kind of dispel some myths there, talk about the importance of it, and hopefully open up some good conversations for families.
I love it.
So Jill, tell us what estate planning entails.
Sure. So estate planning is putting together a plan to protect your assets, not only while you're here, but when you're gone and in any kind of terrible circumstance where you don't have capacity to handle your assets yourself. So it's basically like your safety net.
Okay, awesome. So there's a couple different vehicles for that, right? So probably the thing most people know of is a will.
Absolutely.
So what makes a will something that's an actual legal document? Are there specific criteria that it has to meet?
Right. Is the handbook next to my bed that I've just been writing in, is that a will?
Likely not. So your will has to cover several things. So it has to, have your full legal name. It has to have a list of your assets. It has to say who you want to inherit your assets and list your family, or friends or people that you want, or organizations that you want to receive your assets. And then depending on your state, it either needs to be notarized and witnessed, or potentially you could do a holographic will where just you sign it. That would be typically like a handwritten instrument. So estate planning on the whole is very state dependent. So every single state in the U.S., every country for that matter, is going to have different rules and regulations on how you put together a legally binding estate plan and a legally binding will.
Okay, so that's obviously why it's important to have an attorney involved, right? Because they're going to know the rules for your state.
Certainly.
What happens if you don't have a will and you pass away?
Oh, that's a great question. So the state that you live in has written a will for you. And if you want to have control over who receives your stuff, then you should write one yourself.
Or your kids.
Yeah. So if you die without a will, that is known as dying intestate. That means that those default rules of the state of your residence will then apply to your assets and govern who receives what. Typically, that means that if you're married, your spouse is entitled to a certain percent. If you have children with that spouse, then typically the spouse inherits most of it. And then if you have children from a previous relationship or a relationship after the fact, then potentially your spouse is having to split that inheritance with those children. So it can get very complex. If you die without a spouse and without children, then you're looking at going out on the family tree to siblings, and then going up the family tree to parents, and then out from there to potentially aunts and uncles, grandparents. You kind of have a Downton Abbey situation there where they're looking for that next relative to be able to provide your assets to. So it can get very complex if you don't have kind of stopgap provisions in place. I like to make the conversation a little bit more accessible. So I usually am talking to clients about, who do you want to inherit in the zombie apocalypse? If you're all on the plane, all of your loved ones, all your friends and family, and the plane goes down, who do you want to receive your assets? Do you want it to go to that Downton Abbey situation of trying to find a distant relative? Or do you have a church, charity, nonprofit, or organization that you support that you want to inherit those assets?
I had a real estate client last year, and she oversaw a neighbor in a different state, just helped her whenever she needed help. And I've always had an older neighbor that I looked out for too. Well, she found out she inherited everything of hers because
Oh, my
her husband had
goodness.
already passed away, and she didn't like any of her relatives. And my client's the sweetest thing ever, so
Well, there
she
you go.
was very blessed to get that.
Yeah.
Moral of the story, be nice to people. So what about a trust? How does that different from a will? Do you need a will and a trust? And how do you know if you need a trust?
Great question. So anytime you're going to have a trust, you also have to have a will. So it's like a belt and suspenders approach. So even if you're putting together the trust as the main vehicle for handling the provision of the distribution of your assets, you want that pour over trust, which is what it's called in the case where you have a trust. So that pour over trust gathers up any assets that you forgot to put into the name of the trust, and it pours them into the trust. It basically says, it was always my intention for all of my assets to be owned and held by the trust. And since I didn't get around to changing the ownership of these assets, it's now changed, and they go into the trust and get distributed accordingly.
Are there any types of things that don't go into a trust?
Oh, man.
Or is it just anything that
Pretty much
has
anything
value?
can be held by your trust. So you kind of have some options. And once again, this is not legal advice. This is entirely something that you should discuss with an attorney of your choice. But your personal assets, as far as like bank accounts and things like that, you have options when you set up a trust as far as either changing the ownership of those accounts immediately to the trust, or you can add the trust as a payable on death beneficiary for that account, which both will kind of act to fund that trust, which is one of the most important things to do when you set up a trust, is you want that trust to actually own something of value, so that it's not just a really pretty paperweight sitting on your bookshelf somewhere, holding this wonderful trust that you spent money on that no longer really does what it needs to do because you didn't put any assets into it. So you do want to make sure that you add assets to that trust.
So in order to create a will and or a trust, do you have to do it with an attorney?
It depends on the state, really. If you're going to put together a trust, I would recommend working with an attorney because they're going to know what type of a trust is going to be the best fit. Typically, whenever I am going through an estate planning process with a client, I have a questionnaire that they fill out. So we're looking at particular triggers that would make the most sense to go in the direction of a trust. So things like a blended family where a husband and a wife have gotten together and they have children from a previous relationship. That may make sense to have a joint trust, or it may make sense for each of the spouses to have their own trust. It just kind of depends on the circumstances. A high net worth individual, which right now with the current tax structure would mean that they have 26 million or more in assets as a married couple. If they own property in multiple states and those states don't have the capacity for beneficiary or transfer on death deeds, then it may make more sense for them to have a trust and then own those individual properties via the trust. So if they have beneficiaries who have special needs, we may need a trust, and we may also need a special needs trust for that beneficiary that is looking to inherit. So there are particular conversations that an attorney is pretty essential in to kind of determine what's going to be the best mode for your estate plan.
And that brings up a really good point as well. So far, we've been talking about assets, but the other big piece of your estate planning is if you have kids or pets, it's really important to say who you want them to go to, and not just a person, but the next person and the next person. Like you said, if you all go down on the plane together, what happens? And I think you can make that pretty specific as to what your wishes are, correct?
You can. So guardianship is actually governed in the will. So you would have a will if you have minor children. You would be able to specify in there who you want to become the guardian of your children. A lot of people are told or get information incorrectly on that is binding. It's a preference, but ultimately the courts are going to decide who is going to be the best guardian for that child. But that kind of brings up another point. I always recommend that you have conversations with your family members, especially the ones that you want to appoint as guardian, to make sure that they are willing and able to step up and fill that role. Because if the time came and they were going through the probate process and they were asked by the judge, are you willing and able and in a situation that you can take on raising these children, and they say no, then they are going to have to go to the backup options. Okay. So especially in a dynamic where you may potentially have family dynamics that you don't want your children to go to, having those conversations is so essential, because you're able to explain to your family members why you want them to step up. And also potentially you may want to include a handwritten letter that explains why you want them to go to who you want to, and also why you don't want them to go to others. That could be a very persuasive piece of evidence in a case where guardianship is being determined.
I think that's a really good point. And I feel like for me, when we wrote up our will and trust, this was the hardest thing that we did, is figuring out what we were going to do with our daughter, who we wanted her to go to, because it's a complex issue, right? Like grandparents seem to be the easiest go-to, but as they're getting up in their ages, are they capable? Do they want to? Do they want to have that responsibility, depending on the age of your kids again? Or like for us, my sister, if she lived in Montana, would be a no-brainer, but she lives in Texas. So I put myself in Lexi's shoes. I'm like, both my parents just died. Now I'm going to move to Texas. Like, I don't know that that's the best solution for a teenage girl either. So this is a really complex issue. And I think you're right. I think it makes a lot of sense to have these conversations. And for us, what we ultimately decided was that we would put my mom in as that person that would take care of Lexi. And then she could at least make that decision as to who would be the best one. But we had talked about, do we have some friends that we want to go to? And my mom actually begged me not to do that. She said, please have somebody in the family be the one that's in control of that. And there's another provision of that where we had a separate person that was in charge of the assets for that trust. Yep. And that doesn't have to be the same person that Lexi's going to live with.
I actually prefer it not to be the same person. You have a little bit of separation there, and then you kind of have this checks and balances. So that person that's administrating the financial assets can make sure that the guardian is taking care of the kid. And then the guardian can also make sure that the person taking care of the financial assets is operating on the best interests of the kid too. So
otherwise you run into a Cinderella situation.
Right. Potentially, yeah.
And what happens if the daughter was supposed to move to Texas and live with the aunt, but she doesn't want to because she's doing something specifically at that particular high school that she doesn't feel like she could do in Texas, or she doesn't want to leave her friends or her boyfriend?
That's a great question. I mean, you can add provisions in there to allow the guardian to move to your home. Also, once children are over a certain age, they're able to have more of a voice in the courts. Every state kind of has a different benchmark on what that age is, but potentially she would have the ability to advocate for herself on who she would want to live with. So that's also another possibility. But I think having those conversations with your kids and getting your kids' input on who they would want to live with if something happened to you, it's a hard conversation, I'd say, more on the parents' behalf than the kid's behalf, because for the kid, this is still make-believe. But I think having those conversations is very important so that you also get their insights. The person you think might be the best fit may not be the person that your kid thinks would be the best fit.
That's a really good point. And again, then it's not a surprise to them either. If something does happen, you're trying, let's add as little shock as possible. And I like what you said. I think we actually did that in our will. Was we decided that my mom would move into our house and stay with Lexi, at least in the short term, as kind of a transition period, and the dogs would stay there, and just try to have as much a normal life for her as possible until whatever. Maybe she graduates from high school. She's only got 2 more years, so who knows? Hopefully it's not a reality and we don't have to figure it out. But
Right.
I do think it depends on the age of your kids, certainly.
Every time I
Absolutely.
try to talk to my parents about this, my mom's answer always was, why do you want to talk about this? That sounds horrible. So I never got anywhere regardless.
That's the response that I get a lot when people
Yeah.
are talking to me about life insurance. You know, I'll
Yes.
ask them, have you ever thought about if you want to be cremated or buried? And they're like, I've literally never thought about it, and I don't want to think about it now. And it's part of the conversation. It's
Well, when are you going to think about it?
exactly, yeah, because I know we've had people in my life pass away, and we didn't know what their preferences were. And so it's really awkward and sad and hard to make those decisions for somebody after they're gone. And I would much rather somebody tell me, even if it is awkward and sad in that conversation. You have to think about, if I don't talk about this right now, the people I love the most are going to have to pick up the pieces after I'm
That's
gone.
awful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I would say like a healthcare power of attorney and advance directive are one of the biggest gifts that
Yeah.
you can give to your loved ones, because it really specifies how you want medical professionals to treat you if you're in a situation where you're incapacitated, potentially terminal, no hope for recovery, vegetative state. Do you want to be on life support indefinitely? Do you want to have your plug pulled, for lack of,
Yeah.
Is it power of attorney just a person?
No, so power of attorney are they're binding documents. So you have typically a financial power of attorney that appoints someone to handle your financial assets. They can do anything from opening an account for you, paying credit cards, making sure your mortgage is paid. Let's say you go on a round the world trip and you're in Greece and you put your credit card into the ATM to get money out, and the machine eats your card. That you can text that person, they can call the credit card company and get everything shipped to you overnight back to your cruise ship. So that, anything as simple as that to you're in a coma and your mortgage payment is supposed to go through and something bounced. They can go through the bank and get that paid on your behalf, move money around to accounts that you own, and in order to make sure that your financial state is secure when you are then able to step back in. They can be set up to be active immediately as soon as you sign them. They can be set up to only be active when you're in an incapacitated state. There are pros and cons of each of those. Typically just the sense that if they're active immediately, you're not having to go through doctors or the court process to be declared incapacitated. Think the Britney Spears fiasco. And then having to go through another court proceeding or medical situation in order to be declared to now have capacity. So there are some, benefits and some drawbacks on that. And then you also have a healthcare power of attorney. Healthcare power of attorney appoints the person that you want to make healthcare decisions on your behalf. For instance, like my mom is mine. She's a nurse. Just makes sense.
Duh.
But, she knows if I, fell and hit my face and I had a concussion, and, she knows that I would only want a plastic surgeon to do sutures on my face. Things as simple as that to as complicated as being able to make decisions on surgeries. Being able to make determinations on, whether or not a surgery is necessary, things like that. So
We just had a gray area with my stepfather who had a stroke back in January, so he couldn't speak and he couldn't write. I tried everything, and my mom was the healthcare directive. Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
healthcare power of attorney.
And she didn't know what to ask, so I had to be there and then make suggestions on what she should ask. And if they had just made one of the kids one, it would have been more simple to just have them call us and make the decisions for him. But it was a lot.
It is a lot. And I think back to Jill's original point of that's one of the best gifts you can give your family is to have that healthcare directive and those conversations around what would you want, because that's my actual nightmare, is to have to make a decision for somebody else in my family as to whether you do pull a plug or not. And I know there's a lot of people that are like, don't put me in a home. I'm like, send me to the home. If I am a pain in your ass and I have no quality of life, please send me to the home. I will do puzzles and play cards all day, and I will be so happy. Just, forget about me. Move on.
My
It's
parents
fine.
don't want to go to a home either, but all the bedrooms and bathrooms are upstairs, and they got the stair chair. But my stepdad was not even able to sit in the stair chair to go upstairs. And then they were worried if the power went out or something happens and the paramedics have to go upstairs and get him,
Yeah.
which they've had to do multiple times. But he was downstairs every time, so he couldn't come home.
Yeah.
And that was not his wishes, but we had no other option.
I think going back to you were saying, one of the best gifts you can give your family, I think life insurance is also a really important thing to talk about in the estate planning discussion, because I know personally many people who have lost a family member that didn't have any life insurance, and, they're posting GoFundMes and trying to do fundraisers just to have a funeral. But then you think about, okay, did they have any debts? Did they have a mortgage? Think about the income that they were providing their family that is no longer there. There are so many things that you don't even think about are going to be gone when you're gone too. And so I think it's really important to do a life assessment, put down your assets and liabilities on paper. Think about, do you have young kids that you want to send to college one day? And if you pass away, is there going to be any money to help fund that? And it can be one of the best gifts you can give your family, because at least then it gives them opportunities. Yeah, you might then have the opportunity to pay off the mortgage. Maybe you decide to sell your home and use that money for something else, but you now have the opportunity to make that decision instead of having to panic and make a crazy decision out of crisis.
Yeah.
We'll have to have that discussion on life insurance. My stepdad had a weird one where it lost value over time.
Oh.
So it dwindled from a bigger number to a smaller number. So my mom's worried.
Yeah.
That's all I have left. Well, she's a little better than that, but.
And it's also important to note that you would not want to put minor children as beneficiaries of a life insurance policy. A lot of people put, their spouse as their primary and then their children as their contingent, and they don't realize that life insurance typically will not pay out to minor beneficiaries.
Really?
So what happens?
So they hold on to it until those minors are either 18 or 21. So there are ways that you get around it by, instead of adding the minors as contingent beneficiaries, instead you add my estate or the name of your trust. So there are ways that you can still make sure that your family members receive it, but it's very important to talk to a life insurance professional and an attorney to make sure that that is set up correctly.
Awesome. I got 2 more questions for you. So first is, say we get this will, we get the trust done. How often do you need to update that?
Oh, that is a great question. Okay, so once you have your estate plan in place, a lot of people are like, one and done. It's in place. I don't need to do anything. And that's not the right approach. Anytime you have a major life event, let's say you're about to get divorced, or you're about to get remarried, or you have a child, you
sold property, you bought property.
Absolutely. Yes. So any major purchases or major liabilities that occur, if you have a grandchild, anything like that you would consider a pretty major life event, you want to revisit your estate plan and make sure that it's still accomplishing your goals. See if there's anything that needs to be tweaked in order to better fit your new circumstances. As opposed to that, every 3 to 5 years, you should be taking it out and reading through it and just making sure that it still fits your circumstances.
What about if you own a business?
Yeah, if you own a business, there are definitely tools to make sure that you are taking care of the continuity of your business. So in the state of Montana, ownership in a company is considered personal property. So you can actually do a transfer on death designation for your ownership interests. So that's true for corporations, LLCs, partnerships, anything like that. There are documents that you can put in place to specify who you want to receive those assets when you pass away, whether it's your spouse, your children, or the partner that you're in that business with. You can make sure that those are taken care of.
I have one other question too on the trust. We just got the letter from the governor saying that we were getting the property tax rebate, $675. And on there it specifies that if you have an LLC, your property's in an LLC or in a trust, that you do not qualify. Do you know why that would be?
I think that it's actually only if it's not in a revocable living trust.
Okay.
Yeah. So if it's in a revocable living trust, it still qualifies. I believe if it's an irrevocable trust, it may not.
I think that's right because my property's in a trust and I filed for it and got it last year and I just filed again for it this year. So I'm pretty sure you can in a trust. LLC is probably just because it's supposed to be your primary residence and you shouldn't be owning your property in an LLC if it's primary residence
It's usually
in most
investment
cases.
property.
Yep. And same with your revocable trust. Typically, that's investment property as well.
So revocable is typical for your primary
Correct.
and irrevocable for your
Yep.
investment property.
Yep.
Okay.
So my last question is, now that you have all these estate documents put together, where do you keep it?
Not in a safety deposit box, which is what you see on all the movies. And it seems like, that's the safe place to do it. But banks change hands all the time. So if your documents are in a safety deposit box, you may get some confusion when the bank changes hands. Also, if you don't have your personal representative or your trustee as a co-owner of that box, you could have done everything correct to avoid a probate, which is the court process to settle your estate if you, haven't taken the steps in order to avoid that. And so you may still have to go through this expensive process of probating your estate, even though you've set up a wonderful trust, you have all of your distribution in place, because your representative can't get access to your box. So I would recommend fireproof safe. If that's not available, then, a filing cabinet with a key, lockbox with a code, anything like that. But you want to make sure that somebody knows how to access those documents.
What about multiple copies of it that are notarized?
Yeah, copies are great. Only the original is going to be the document that can be provided to a court.
Okay.
So you do want to make sure that you have the original somewhere safe. But it's definitely wonderful to have copies to your power people, so that they know that, number one, they're a power person, and number two, what they are supposed to do. Absolutely, you can have copies out there, but you also want them to be able to access the original.
My mom always said it's in the safe or in the lockbox. I didn't even know what bank she banked at.
Well, that's a thing. And when I can remember when I worked for a bank one time, that was a constant thing. They were trying to track down people who, there hadn't been any payment on their lockbox or nobody had done anything on their account in years. Like there's massive lists that the state keeps track of all these assets that has nowhere to go. So if nobody knows they're there. And the same thing with your life insurance. If your heirs don't know that you have a life insurance policy, they're not going to know to claim it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Life insurance company's not going to be like, oh, I heard this person died. Here's some money.
No.
We had to go through all my stepdad's files after he passed away and try to figure out what he had.
I would say one of the most important things to do, too, is to have a list of your accounts and a list of the auto pays, because I've heard some horror stories from clients where they were moving one of their relatives out of state in order to go to a home and be closer to family. So as part of that process, they were closing their local accounts at those banks. Well, one of them had auto pay set up for his life insurance policy, but they closed that account and didn't know that they needed to transfer it to a new account, and so stopped paying the premium. A couple months later, the gentleman passes away. Well, now his life insurance has lapsed because they didn't realize the auto payment was set up on that local account.
Ouch.
We discovered my stepdad had been paying $14 a month for AOL email.
Oh my goodness. You've got mail.
Oh, that's funny.
And he did not have it on auto pay.
Oh, no.
Well, I think this is another good point, though. Not only like where your accounts are, but maybe your passwords, especially like if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, my husband would struggle trying to figure out. I mean, most of my things are on auto pay, but to get into all the different credit card accounts and all of that kind of stuff would be a lot. So maybe having a list of accounts and passwords. And I also heard a tip that you should always have your power bill set up on an auto pay from a bank account, not a credit card, because if everybody is still left living in your house, at least the power is not going to get turned off on them in the meantime.
That's a good point. And one of the most difficult ones to get shut off that I have heard horror stories from clients on who have powers of attorney, or even who have letters testamentary appointing them as the personal representative for the decedent's estate, is your cable bill.
Really?
Yep. Cable and satellite television, they do not want to cancel, and they refuse to work with you, even if you're a power of attorney for somebody incapacitated. So just make sure that you leave that password somewhere safe.
Jeez.
Okay, so what happens if you pass away and haven't done anything? No will, no trust. What happens?
You leave a It's a process. If you don't have anything set up, a relative has to step up, or a family member, or a friend, and they have to start the probate process for your estate. So they basically have to go to the courts, file to open a probate for your estate, and they have to show the court that you did not have a will or a trust in place. They have to be appointed as the personal representative, and then their job is to gather up all of your assets, wherever they may be, pay off any debts. So typically the probate is open for a set amount of time, depends on state law. And during that time, creditors can come forward and say, I'm owed money by the estate. And then if they're a verified claim, then they have to be paid. And then anything that remains is distributed to your family members based on the intestate laws of the state.
We had that happen with my husband's mother when she passed away. She did not want to pay whatever she needed to pay to put a will together. And luckily, her granddaughter is a corporate accountant and knew how to take care of everything.
Good.
Because the 4 boys had no clue.
Yep.
And it caused a big rift trying to figure out how to sell the house.
Oh, yeah.
How to fix up the house, what to
Yeah.
do with the car, and then her investment accounts.
It all comes back to good conversations. And I think that brings us back to the beginning here, where we're just trying to get you to have those conversations with your family, your spouse, whoever your loved ones are, and try to make that a little bit less taboo so that we leave our families with a little bit less of a shit show. So, so thanks for your time, ladies. I appreciate all of the knowledge that you're sharing with us, and stay tuned. We are going to be chatting about some planning when you're going to maybe buy a house or have shared assets with somebody that you
We're
maybe
not
aren't married to. So stay tuned for that next time.